Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Dirshu Mishnah Berurah share. We are holding in Mishnah Berurah Chelik K. We'll be learning today Mitzvah Hashem Daf Kuf Bem Amud Aleph. We're continuing to learn Hilchos Yom Tov. We are in middle of Siman Tov Kuf Yud Zayin, which we will hopefully complete today. We pick up on the very top line of Kuf Bem Amud Aleph near the end of Sif Aleph. You know what? I think just for continuity's sake, I'm going to read Sif Aleph all the way from the beginning. We did the Mishnah Berurah. It's a very quick read just to get the flow right. Says the Mechaber on Kuf Lamed Tes Amud Beis and the beginning of Sif Aleph. Laimar lechenveni laseis leibeitzim oyegayzim oyshar mine meichel umishteh. If somebody wants to ask a merchant, a shopkeeper, to give him eggs, nuts, other types of foodstuffs or beverages, dine b'Yom Tov k'may b'Shabbos, the halacha is on Yom Tov the same as it is on Shabbos. Where you can do a deal with a merchant, you cannot mention a monetary amount, you can't set a price, you have to buy on credit, and the terms of the deal will be arranged after Shabbos or after Yom Tov. According to some, you can't even mention a weight or a size. If the merchant is a non-Jew, if you're dealing with a non-Jewish merchant, you can't acquire from him on Yom Tov something which is still found like apples where they're still on the trees. If most of the apples in the locale are still on the trees, you can't acquire apples from him. You can't acquire from him something like fish, which has to be trapped. Unless you could tell that they weren't freshly picked or freshly caught today. Otherwise, you have to be choshed that they may have been caught or picked on Yom Tov, in which case there would be muktzah. Similarly, you can't acquire fresh eggs from this non-Jewish merchant because there's a possibility that those eggs were laid today, in which case, again, there would be muktzah. However, other items that have no problem of being mechuber, and they have no problem that you have to be choshish that they might have been trapped, let's say chickens, which are considered nitzoid va'imid, so you don't have to be choshish that maybe the chicken was trapped today on Yom Tov, and certainly you don't have to worry that the chicken was picked from the tree on Yom Tov. You're allowed to acquire it from him on Yom Tov, with keeping in mind the restrictions of Yom Tov that you can't set a price, etc. Even if they came today from outside of the Tchum, because even if they came to the shopkeeper from outside of the Tchum, it wasn't brought from outside of the Tchum for the Yisraelim. It was brought from the outside of the Tchum for the shopkeeper. And the Mishnah Berurah spoke out, that's only true in a city where it's ruba non-Jews, if the majority of the city is non-Jews. If it would be a city where the majority of the city were Yidden, then we would say that it came from outside of the Tchum for the purposes of the Yidden, and then you would have to wait until after Kadesha Yayasu, after Yom Tov. Continues the Mechaber on the bottom line, V'chein kemach, similarly flour, shenitchan hayoim, be'ir sheruba eino Yehudim. If you have flour, if you want to buy flour from a shopkeeper, and the flour was ground today, so as the Mishnah Berurah explained, if most of the customers who are buying flour are non-Jews, then you have no problem buying that flour because there's no problem of meleches iser. The forbidden grinding that was done by the non-Jew was not done for Yisraelim, it was done for non-Jews, so it's not a problem. And therefore, you're allowed to acquire it from the non-Jew shopkeeper. Okay, and now we pick up from where we were holding yesterday. Continues the Mechaber. You could also acquire from a non-Jewish shopkeeper freshly baked bread, even though it was baked today on Yom Tov. Explains the Mishnah Berurah, nice cut in hay here on Kuf Mem Amud Aleph. Likach mimenu pas, you can acquire fresh bread from him. What the Mechaber wants to say is, even if you know that the flour that was used for the baking of this bread was ground today on Yom Tov, and toichin is something which is also on Yom Tov, it's still not a problem. Why? Since we're dealing with a city where most of the consumers are non-Jews, so the forbidden labors of the grinding of the flour and the harkada, the sifting of the flour, which would be a forbidden form of Berurah on Yom Tov, because it's usually something that's done in bulk. So we can assume that these malachas were done by the non-Jew on behalf of the non-Jewish customers, which comprise the majority of his customers. So it wasn't done on behalf of Yidden, and therefore it's not a problem that it was done on Yom Tov. Now, if it would be a case where you happen to know that the flour that the baker is using was ground and sifted before Yom Tov, then you would be allowed to buy this fresh bread from this non-Jewish merchant, even if it's a city where most of the consumers are Yidden. Because why not? What problem is there? As far as the baking that was done today on Yom Tov, it's okay if this non-Jewish baker baked his bread on behalf of Yidden on Yom Tov. You're allowed to bake on Yom Tov. It's like nefesh. You're allowed to bake fresh challah on Yom Tov. So it's no problem that the guy baked on behalf of Yidden on Yom Tov. And the tchina and the harkada, we said we're talking about a case where you know that it was done before Yom Tov. So there's no problem here. The Achronim write, all of these cases where we say that it's mutter for you to acquire something from a non-Jewish shopkeeper, we're talking about a case where, for instance, the price of a loaf of bread is already well established and well known. So you're not going to be doing any haggling with the baker to decide on a price for the loaf of bread. Because if that's not the case, if you do have to have a discussion with the non-Jewish baker over the price, then Gam Gabi Yisrael Aser, then even to acquire a loaf of bread from a Yiddish shopkeeper is Aser. You're not allowed to haggle price on Yom Tov. You have to look back in Siman Shin Chav Gimel and Shabbos, where this is discussed in greater detail. Oid Kasru, the Achronim also write, let's say you're dealing with a non-Jewish shopkeeper and he doesn't trust you. He's not willing to extend credit to you. You say that you're going to pay him after Yom Tov, but he doesn't know you, so he's not comfortable. You're allowed to give him some collateral. You could give him your watch and tell him, listen, hold on to my watch and I'll pay you after Yom Tov. I guess that's only if you're buying a lot of bread. Otherwise, it doesn't sound to me like a watch is a fair mashkin for a loaf of bread. But you cannot invite the non-Jew to come over to your house, so you could point out to him, there's my wallet, so that he should go take the money. The heavy alcohol pana moved to the chayil, because that would be usher, at least because of uvda the chayil. Even if we're not going to answer it, that it's straight mekach umemka, that you're giving him the money, but it's definitely uvda the chayil, it's definitely commercial activity on Yom Tov, which we're going to answer. And you can't even do this through the agency of a non-Jew. Now, there's a very interesting Sharatzian over here. Sharatzian ois kotnehei. V'hinei b'chemed Moshe kasav, the Chemed Moshe writes, very interesting, sha'aser litein la'akum amoyis me erev Yom Tov. The Chemed Moshe says, you're not allowed to give a non-Jew money on erev Yom Tov. She'yitein loy pas b'Yom Tov. So you're going to give the non-Jewish baker $3 on erev Yom Tov, and you tell him, listen, I'm going to come to you on Yom Tov, give me a loaf of bread. You're not allowed to do that. Sounds very interesting. Why not? You gave him the money already on erev Yom Tov. What's the problem? Says the Chavetz Chaim, V'la'anias daiti, says in his humble opinion, Acharei she'itiru chachamim, leilech eitzel chenveni harogel etzloi, v'likach mimenu b'Yom Tov. The Chavetz Chaim says over here that he doesn't understand this Chemed Moshe. If we know that the halacha is that you're allowed to go to a shopkeeper who you're familiar with on Yom Tov and you're allowed to go take a loaf of bread from him on Yom Tov with the understanding that you're going to close the deal and you're going to pay him after Yom Tov. Uperisham Rashi, and Rashi explains why is this mutter? The Kevin Cherogel Etzloi, because since you're dealing with a shopkeeper who's familiar with you, he knows you, Ma'aminoi Beloy Nesinas Mois B'Yom Tov. He's going to trust you, even though you're not giving him any money on Yom Tov. Vim Kain, if so, if we know that the Gemara says that you're allowed to go to a shopkeeper who you know, who knows you, and you're allowed to go to him on Yom Tov. You didn't pay him anything before Yom Tov. You're allowed to go to him on Yom Tov, and he's going to give you a loaf of bread on the understanding that you're going to pay him after Yom Tov. If that's mutter, and Rashi says the reason it's mutter is because no problem. Since he knows you, he trusts you, and you don't have to give him any money on Yom Tov. So why is it worse if I gave him money on Erev Yom Tov? So why on earth should you ask for that? Okay, the Chavetz Chaim continues here in the Sharatzin, and he explains the Evsher could be the Svarasai, that the Svar of the Chem and Moshe, to answer this, if you gave the money before Yom Tov is, if you go to a non-Jew on Yom Tov, and you tell him, give me a loaf of bread, and we'll deal with it after Yom Tov. So he gave you a loaf of bread, but the deal is not done. The Mekach Memkar is incomplete because you didn't pay him yet. But if you give him $3 before Yom Tov, and now he gives you the loaf of bread on Yom Tov, then when you receive the loaf of bread from him, the deal is closed. So you sealed the Mekach Memkar on Yom Tov. And maybe that's why, that's what the Chavetz Chaim is suggesting, maybe that's why the Chem and Moshe holds that this is problematic. Achein, however, while that sounds nice, he says, Midivrei Hagal El B'Siman Shin Chafei Sif Daled, from the words of the Ramah that we had earlier in Hilchos Shabbos in Shin Chafei Sif Daled, the Kosav, where the Ramah writes, Aser Litein Mois Be'erev Shabbos, you're not allowed to give a non-Jew money on Erev Shabbos, Sheyiten Lo Yapas B'Shabbos, so that he'll give you a loaf of bread on Shabbos. Why? Mishum the Uz, because if you do that, if you give a non-Jew $3 for a loaf of bread on Erev Shabbos, and you tell him you're going to pick up the bread on Shabbos, the Uz Adaita D'Yisrael Kavod. Now, when he bakes bread on Shabbos, he's doing it for you. So he's doing Meleches Isser for the Yisrael. That you're not allowed to do. You hear? Now, over here, we're talking about a different case. We're talking about Shabbos over here. So we're saying, we have a Ramah in Hilchos Shabbos that says, if you want to do this on Shabbos, if you want to give a guy $3 for a loaf of bread on Erev Shabbos, not Erev Yom Tov, and you tell him I'm going to pick up the bread on Shabbos, the Ramah says that's a problem. Why? Because now the non-Jew is going to bake the bread on Shabbos for you. Then you can't eat the bread. He's doing Meleches Isser. He's baking on Shabbos on your behalf. But what do you see from there? Vim Kain, B'Yom Tov Kahai Gavna, Dein Lachush Mishum Afia. The implication of the Ramah is that that's a problem on Shabbos because he's going to bake the bread for you, and that's Meleches Isser on Shabbos. But on Yom Tov, baking is not Meleches Isser because you're allowed to bake on Yom Tov. So if you want to do this on Yom Tov, the implication of the Ramah is okay. It's also on Shabbos because of the forbidden baking. But it would be mutter on Yom Tov because on Yom Tov, the baking is not Meleches Isser. The Hamuteres B'Yom Tov, Ein Lachish B'Zeh Mishum Mekach Memkar. The implication of the Ramah, where he answers this on Shabbos only because of the Meleches Isser of the Afiyah, and he doesn't have a problem with the Mekach Memkar. So then on Yom Tov, there's no problem of Afiyah because Afiyah is mutter on Yom Tov. It should be fine. So the Chavetz Chaim seems to disagree with this Chem and Moshe, and he brings a raya from this Ramah in Hilchos Shabbos that it doesn't seem to be right. Okay. Ice cotton vav in the Mishnah Berurah. The Mechaber said you're allowed to buy fresh bread you're allowed to acquire fresh bread from the non-Jewish merchant that was baked on Yom Tov. Sha'afa boy b'yoyim. Ice cotton vav. Ayin beis Yosef v'darkei Moshe sheyesha machmirin bazeh. There are those who are machmir and hold that this is aser. However, the Shulchan Aruch rules like the more makel opinions. The Kosav HaChayodam, the Chayodam writes, that you should only be makel and do this in a Eis HaTorah. Okay. The last words of Sif Aleph, second line, the words of the Ramah, V'chein This is also mutter im nefa b'Shabbos shalafanov. If you have a day of Yom Tov following Shabbos, Sunday is Yom Tov, and you have the non-Jewish baker baked bread on Shabbos, and now you want to acquire it from him on Sunday on Yom Tov, we're saying that's okay. It's not a problem. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cutting vav she'afa it's cutting zayin. What the Rambam wants to say is, we're not going to go ahead and answer this because of hachana. Now, we're not going to answer it because of meleches iser. The fact that the guy baked the bread on Shabbos is not a problem, because again, we're talking about a city that's ruba nachrim. Most of the city are goyim, so the fact that the non-Jewish baker baked bread on Shabbos, that's not meleches iser. He did it on behalf of goyim, not on behalf of Yisraelim. But you might have thought that there's a problem of hachana. We know that Shabbos is not allowed to be meichin for Yom Tov, and the guy baked this bread on Shabbos before Yom Tov. So maybe that's called Shabbos being meichin for Sunday of Yom Tov, and it should be aser. So that's why the Mishnah Berurah says over here inside the Laimar, what the Ramah is telling you when he tells you that this is mutter, he's telling you the lo yasvina le mishum hachana shemeichin mishabbos liyom tov. We don't consider this to be problematic hachana, and we're not going to answer this and say that Shabbos is being meichin for Yom Tov. Why? Hayol de beikar adin after Shabbos gufa mutter lechel. Because really, when the guy baked this bread on Shabbos, really you'd be allowed to eat that bread even on Shabbos. Why not? Again, the malacha was not done for you. The malacha was done for a guy. Even though earlier in Hilchas Shabbos in Shin Chafeisiv Daled, we said that because of Chumrah the Shabbos, we should be machmer on Shabbos and we shouldn't eat that bread that was baked on Shabbos. Shaloi b'shasat chak, unless it's a shasat chak. Al kolpanim b'yomter shalach ravein lahachmir. But we're not going to be so machmir and say that we're going to aser it on Sunday Yom Tov because we're going to consider it hachana. It's not hachana because the challah was already edible really on Shabbos. So Shabbos was meichin for Shabbos. Shabbos wasn't meichin for Yom Tov. It's only we're machmir because of the chumrah of Shabbos. We're machmir, we won't eat it on Shabbos. But that doesn't create a hachana problem. Okay. Let's go to Sif Beis. Yisrael sha'amar le'ena Yehudi mi'ba'od yom. If a Yid says to a guy on Erev Yom Tov, Tikneli yoinim lamachar, do me a favor, tomorrow is my holiday, tomorrow is Yom Tov, do me a favor, go tomorrow on Yom Tov and buy some nice doves, some nice birds for me that I could shecht and eat on Yom Tov. Says the Mechaber, lo yafe oise. That's not proper. He didn't do a nice thing. Let's take a look right away at the Mishnah Berurah ois katan ches. Lamachar. The Yid said to the non-Jew on Erev Yom Tov, Ritzana loymar l'tzarech Yom Tov. On Erev Yom Tov, he asked the non-Jew, do me a favor, tomorrow on Yom Tov, go buy some doves or some chickens for me, so I should have fresh chicken for my Yom Tov Suda. Ois katan tes, the Mechaber says, lo yafe oise. It's not good what he did. It's not nice what he did. Pirish, the explanation of this is, this is true whether the Yid actually gave money to the guy and told the guy, do me a favor, tomorrow on Yom Tov, take this money and go buy me doves. Or he asked the guy, do me a favor, you lay out the money, you buy the birds, and I'll pay you back after Yom Tov. In either case, b'chol inyan aser. Either way, this is prohibited. Lo yafe aser. It's not proper what the Yid did. Even if the non-Jew is not going to buy it at all, he's not going to use money at all. The non-Jew is going to go to a merchant and he's going to say, look, I'm picking up 2 fresh birds from my Jewish friend and we'll take care of the deal after Yom Tov. Even so, you should not ask a non-Jew to do this for you on Yom Tov. Afilu hachi aser, this is still prohibited. Because the non-Jew doesn't know the halachas of mekach umemkar and Yom Tov, and ostensibly the non-Jew is going to go to the merchant and he's going to say, how much are the birds? The birds are $3 a piece. No problem. The Jew will come in after Yom Tov, or I'll come in after Yom Tov and I'll take care of it. But now he's set a price, and we know that a Yid is not allowed to do a deal that way on Yom Tov. A Yid is not allowed to set a price on Yom Tov. Fahatam. And the reason why this is a problem, The reason why the Mechaber says over here, Lo Yafe Asa, that this is not a nice thing that he did. You shouldn't ask a non-Jew to do a deal for you on Yom Tov. Because the rule is that whatever a Yid is not allowed to do himself, he's not allowed to ask a non-Jew to do it for him on Yom Tov. Even if he asks the non-Jew to do it on Erev Yom Tov. In other words, Amir La'akum is a problem, not only if on Yom Tov you ask the non-Jew to do something that you're not allowed to do, even if you ask the non-Jew to do it on Erev, even if you make the request on Erev Yom Tov, but you ask the non-Jew to do it on Yom Tov, since you're not allowed to do it on Yom Tov, you're not allowed to have him do it on Yom Tov. So you're not allowed to go buy things on Yom Tov. You can ask the non-Jew to buy things for you on Yom Tov. Now, let's continue the Mechaber. The Mechaber said, Lo yafe oisa, you didn't do a nice thing. Avalim asa kvar, but if you did it, b'di'eved, muter lechol mehem b'yom tov, you're allowed to eat those birds on Yom Tov. Now, not the Mechaber and not the Mishnah Berurah, they don't explain why this is muter b'di'eved. So again, you're not allowed to ask a guy, go buy something for me on Yom Tov. Even if he's not gonna do it, even if he's not actually gonna pay for it, you're still not allowed to ask him to do it on Yom Tov. But b'di'eved, if you did, you're allowed to eat it. I think the reason is because why is this also? This is also because of Amir La'akum. It's also because whatever you're not allowed to do, you're not allowed to ask a guy to do for you. But really, there is a way where it's mutter for you to acquire fresh birds on Yom Tov. You yourself are allowed to go to a merchant on Yom Tov and say, look, give me the birds on credit, and we'll deal with it after Yom Tov. And you don't name a price or anything else. You're allowed to do that on Yom Tov. So there is a way that you're allowed to acquire fresh birds from a merchant on Yom Tov. So if you ask a non-Jew to do it for you, okay, he might go ahead and pay for it. He might go ahead and name a price, which you're not allowed to do. But since there is a way for you to accomplish your goal, beheter, your goal is to get the fresh birds for Yom Tov. And there's a way that you could do it beheter. So if you b'di'eved, if you ask a non-Jew to do it for you, even if he's going to do it not in a heterdik way, still the b'di'eved, that's okay. I believe that's pshat. Continues the Mechaber. By me, it's near the end of the third line, right by the ice cut and yud for the Mishnah Berurah. When is this mutter? V'hu shelo yihiyu mafrichen. This is only if the type of birds that you're asking the non-Jew to get for you on Yom Tov are birds that don't have to be trapped. They're not birds that go flying away that you have to go trap them in order to get them. But if they have to be trapped, then you have a problem because then the non-Jew is going to do Meleches Hisser for you on Yom Tov. He's going to go trap the birds. That's tzad. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cutting yud v'hu shelo yihiyu mafrichen. Pirish does leka behem mishum tzeda. If they're not birds that are going to fly away when the guy tries to get them, so then there's no Isser Malacha of tzeda. Because since they can't fly, they're like chickens that are considered already trapped. But if they're birds that mamish fly away, then you have to worry that when the guy goes to acquire these birds for you, he's going to get birds that were trapped today. So then Meleches Isser was done for you on Yom Tov. And even though you'll tell me, well, maybe it's a city that's Roiv Akum, so even if it was trapped on behalf of Goyim, or even if the guy became trapped by themselves, we all know the it's still muktzah. If the guy is going to go acquire birds for you that had to be trapped on Shabbos, so that means before they were trapped, they were muktzah. If they were muktzah at the outset of Yom Tov, then they're muktzah for the whole Yom Tov. One problem you don't have to worry about was earlier on we learned a whole siman about if you have a dovecote or you have a coop and you want to shecht some of the birds in that coop on Yom Tov, but not all of them. We said you have to be mazmin, the ones that you're gonna shecht. You have to say, I'm gonna shecht that bird. Otherwise, you have a muktzah problem. Over here, you don't have to be mazmin the birds. You don't have a hazmana problem. Why? Because they belong to a non-Jew. until the non-Jew gets them for you, they belong to the non-Jewish merchant. And the shalakum ain't tzarech hachana. The property of a guy doesn't need hachana, not to be muktzah, because hakol mechen eitzel ha'akum. There's no dinam of muktzah by the non-Jews, so it's all considered. I'm trying to think of the past tense word. It's muchan, right? It's all considered muchan. Of course, we're also talking about here with where whatever the non-Jew is going to acquire for you was already inside the tchum. Or even if it came from outside of the tchum, if it's a city that's mostly goyim, so it was brought into the tchum on behalf of goyim, the adaitam huvu. But if it's a city that's mostly Yidden, and the products came from outside of the Tchum, then it was brought in from outside of the Tchum on behalf of Yidden, so that it's also until Matzah Yom Tov, after the time of Kadesha Yeyasu, enough time that it could have been transported from outside of the Tchum on Matzah Yom Tov. The Chanal b'Siman Tavkuf Tezvav. Ois Cotton Yud Aleph. Oh, we have to finish the Mechaber. We have to finish the Mechaber in Sif Beis. Avalim Rogil Bekach. We said that B'di'eved, this is okay. B'di'eved, if you did ask the non-Jew to acquire something for you on Yom Tov, B'di'eved, you're allowed to eat it. However, says the Mechaber, Avalim Rogil Bekach. If this becomes your Rogil, you do this habitually. Every Yom Tov, you're asking a guy to acquire stuff for you on Yom Tov, and you're saying it's mutter b'di'eved, also lechal mehem, then you're not allowed to eat it because it's not called b'di'eved. If you're habitually doing this, that's no longer b'di'eved. You're doing it lechatchila. Ice cutting it off in the Mishnah Berurah, also lechal mehem, hainu ad le'erev, v'chdei sheyeyosek, k'dei shelo mimenu shekanu avurei b'Yom Tov. Okay, final sif in the Siman, sif dalet, lo yamayid adam sa'irim litain lifnei behemtoi. You're not allowed to measure out a measure of grain, a measure of barley. You have to feed your animals, and you want to know that you're feeding your cow 2 pounds of barley. So you have a measuring utensil, and you want to measure out 2 pounds of barley. You're not allowed to do that. Lo yamayid adam sa'irim litain lifnei behemtoi. You're not allowed to measure it out to give an exact measure to your animals. You have to approximate the amount. Says the Mishnah Berurah, he's cutting your basil yimdaid, because when you go measure grain, it looks like you're doing business. It looks like you're measuring out 2 pounds of grain in order to sell 2 pounds of grain. That's why you're not allowed to measure. That concludes Siman Tov Kuf Yud Zayin. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. Mirz Hashem, I guess we'll reconvene after Shabbos. Everybody should have a wonderful, safe, healthy, enjoyable, relaxing Shabbos. Once again, I'd like to wish a refuah shalema to Chaim Yeshua ben Frumit, who should have a refuah shalema b'seich shar chayla Yisrael. Be well.